Hi everybody, and welcome to the first session, I guess, in our reread series. I'm here with the lovely Clare Gray. We are, of course, reading A Song of Ice, rereading, or reading for the first time, some of you maybe, A Song of Ice and Fire, starting with Game of Thrones. So you can see I have lots of these massive post-it notes ready to go. Clare, if you want to just say a quick hello and then we'll get stuck in.
Yeah, hi everyone. You know me from House Polished and the TV show reviews with Kat and Lisa. And I've read the book several times. It's actually been a few years since I reread the books, and this time I'm listening to the audio. So this is a slightly new experience for me, but I'm really excited about talking to Kat about this and seeing what we're getting from this reread.
And Mr. C, who's in the chat, and I know he has his book eagerly clutched to his in his hand inside. I know he's ready to. He's got a can of beer and he's ready to chime in with questions if he has any. So we're going to launch straight into the prologue. Has to be said, still probably my favorite prologue of the series. We're going to start out with non-spoilery for every chapter. And then we'll give you a massive red flag warning when we're going to start doing spoilery stuff. And when I wave my pen again, it'll be safe to listen. Okay, so we'll do non-spoilery at the beginning of every chapter discussion and then spoilery stuff. So the prologue opens north of the Wall, and we have got men of the Night's Watch, Sir Royce, Garrett and Will, who is our point of view character in this chapter. So Claire, what did you and it's June 297, I know at the time as well. So Claire, what did you get from the prologue this time round?
I think what's happening with me is I'm taking a much more technical viewpoint on it. So I'm looking at different aspects to the story, and so I'm listening to especially numbers. For some reason, numbers are really jumping out at me this time. Just it obviously this chapter opens up and introduces the land beyond the Wall, so we get to find out what the Wall is, what the Night's Watch is, and that there's this territory beyond the Wall. And something about the Night's Watch, about their duties, their vows. And I was just thinking things like, one of the things that made me raise an eyebrow was just each of the three characters that are in the prologue, where they're placed in the Night's Watch. So you've got Garrett, who's been in the Night's Watch for 40 years. Will, who's been there for 4 years. But he proclaims that he's been on 100 rangings, which means that he goes beyond the Wall every 2 weeks. So he must be fairly experienced because he's out there every 2 weeks, so he knows the territory. And he also draws a watch basically the way I calculated it is 6 nights a week he's on a watch on the Wall. So you can tell straight away that he's overworked, that the Night's Watch is undermanned. And the other thing that made me question the kind of pecking order of the three is we're introduced to Royce as well. So we begin to find out that there are these ancient houses and families. And but it was just a question really, which is, why is Royce in command when he's only been part of the Night's Watch for 6 months? Just made me think that's unusual, because I need something like spoilery, that it takes a lot longer in the as we progress through the series. You're there for a while before you take your vows, and then you go out ranging. To be in command of a ranging just seems a bit unusual to me. So is he? Why did that happen? Has he got a special? Is there a special reason why he was in charge. I mean, he's brand new. He's brand new to the Night's Watch, so I was just a bit unsure of why he was in command. It's his first ranging, so yeah. Obviously, we're introduced to the others, and we get quite a good description of who they are. Very mysterious. When I was reading through the prologue or listening to the prologue, Stuart was listening, and he was saying the question that he has about this entire chapter is, why are the others so far south? So this is the introduction to this. You know, not only do they exist, but they're in a different location than they've been in for a long, long time. So what is the reason that they're moving so far south? So all of these, it raises lots and lots of questions in the prologue. Yeah, I'll leave that for now. I thought it was interesting to get a good idea of who the Night's Watch are, who the brothers are, what the pecking order is, what a day in the life of a member of the Night's Watch might feel like, and then we get this introduction of this other ethereal kind of race of people, and we're not quite sure whether they come across as quite sinister, and that's our introduction to them. So interesting.
Yeah, and I think what's even more interesting is, I like, especially in the opening few chapters, the others take you is repeated so much, and like, we know that it's going to be heavy foreshadowing. So even if you're reading this for the first time and a lot of it doesn't totally make sense and a lot of names are being thrown at you, little things like that, the others take you. There's a nice payoff at the end of just the prologue. And one of the things that strikes me about the prologue is, and one of the reasons why it's still one of my favorite chapters, maybe in the entire series, is because it shows George R. Martin's skill at writing short stories and editing short stories, and it's just like this lovely little condensed horror story. Like, even if it ended where it ended and we never had another series, that it's just a nice little mystery story in and of itself. But I totally get what you're saying about the hierarchy in this society. It does also kind of introduce you, I guess, to the feudal aspects of the entire world at this point. My big question about Royce is, why is he in the Night's Watch? Because it seems to me like he's a young guy. Like, later on in Jon's chapter, Ben says to him, well, you know, go off and have a few bastards of your own first. Like, I've always wondered, why is Royce in the Night's Watch? What is the deal with that, and how was he allowed to join the Night's Watch so young, and why did he want to? It's a bit strange, but there's lots of references to the dead, and I know Secrets of the Citadel, I think she had a reread series where she always references the first line of this chapter as being, we should start back, and I think it's very fitting. And there's another line very, very quickly into this chapter where Garrett says, I think it's Garrett says, dead is dead. And that's something that George R. R. Martin will say again and again and again, dead is dead. So again, it's just kind of playing with the mystery of it. It's not just an ordinary zombie story, this, that we're going to get.
Well, I think it's... Oh, sorry, I keep switching the microphone on and off because I'm eating a Bakewell tart, so I'm trying not to make too much noise. I think it's Royce who says that there are things to be learned even from the dead, and I've just made a note here. What can the dead teach us? Yeah. What lessons can be learned from the dead? So right at the very beginning, there's this thing about, you know, dead people being reanimated, possibly, or yeah, which obviously it's really difficult actually not to talk about spoilers and things that happen later on. But a lot of these initial chapters, particularly the 10 that we've been looking at, there's a lot of world building and introductions to the different aspects of the story. But certainly I agree, in the prologue, death is talked about a lot. Also, the cold is talked about a lot. I mean, I know that just from the description of where they are, and the fact that Garrett has already lost 2 of his ears from the cold, you know it's bitterly cold.
And it's not even winter yet.
Exactly, yeah. But there's, as well as things to be learned from the dead, I think there's also things that we can learn from the cold. That the others bring the cold, and there's this kind of fear that comes with the cold, and that feeling that it's different to what we understand in, you know, normal day-to-day Westeros, this side of the wall. There's something different, which, but as we go into the series, you know, there are elements, there are kind of magical elements that present themselves, and I think certainly within this chapter that features as well. There's something about the cold, and there's something different, i.e. possibly magical, about, just particularly about the cold.
But it's very subtle, and I think, just going back to what you were saying about the hierarchy among these 3 characters in particular, honor and duty and justice is really important in the opening chapters. But what's very interesting is that we have this aloofness set up between us as a reader. We get more of Will and Garrett's point of view than we do of Royce's point of view. And then it was kind of like, for up until Tyrion 1, which is what we read for today, it was like we're just with our aristocracy again. Like, we have this opening moment with commoners, and then suddenly we're like plunged into just this aristocratic kind of world, which I thought was, it's very interesting that he does open it with a commoner, and I'm, you know, I'm always kind of watching out for that when I read. I liked the idea that we are introduced to a lot of random house names: Mallister, Mormont, what are the other ones? I have them here. Royce, then we get Maester Aemon, and we get King Robert. So just kind of a random selection of names at the beginning. And we're also told that one of the wildlings is a Far Eyes, whatever that is. And we also get mentioned of bears and direwolves and all these kind of strange creatures. So it'll be interesting, you know, if you're reading this for the first time, it's kind of hard to keep track of all these things as they're coming in. But when you go back and read it again, you're like, wow, they've mentioned all this stuff right here in the prologue, in the first few pages. So it's kind of, it's interesting how much. My question, I have a lot of questions about the others, and I love that our introduction to the others is the others made no sound, or something like that, as they come in. And they're also they mock him at one stage. They're referred to as having white shadows and color shifting armor. So they're almost alien like.
They're not just mocking, they're actually laughing. So there's something about them that just makes you feel uncomfortable straight away. You know, there's just, everything is different about them: their appearance, their language, how they fight.
The blades are described as sounding like animals, like screeching, kind of this screeching sound. You can just kind of imagine it. It's really, that the imagery there is amazing with the fight. My question with Royce is, and this isn't spoilery, but I just want to know, are we going to see him again? Because we see him again at the end of this prologue. So I did like how Will looks at him, and when he sees Royce's dead body at the end of this chapter, he says he could see the boy, and it's almost like it's a loss of innocence straight away, like a loss of innocence in the world, like something strange has happened here, something weird has happened. And Will is making all these plans to go and bring the weapon, the other's weapon, back to the castle, but we know that's not going to happen. And I did like when Royce finally stands up to and faces Will. He's standing over Will. his clothes are all a tatter already. And it's kind of like the hierarchy that you mentioned earlier on. It's like death is a great leveler, you know.
Yeah.
Everybody looks like shit.
Yeah.
Everybody's the same when you're dead, you know. I just really kind of liked that. I hadn't noticed that the first time I read it. His clothes were all a tatter, going from the fine clothes, you know, his fine clothes were all the tatters. I really liked that bit. But maybe some spoilery stuff now. I'll wave this, say hello, spoilery stuff. So if you want to mute me for a while, I'll wave the pen again to let you know. So Claire, any majorly spoilery stuff about this chapter?
I just about the cold and the something different, which I was struggling to avoid talking about before, which is, we know that we have that it's just this element of magic, and further on in the books, where we're up to where the books finish, we are quite, not that we know exactly how it works, but we are much more familiar with fire magic than we are with ice magic. And I think this is, we know this right from the very beginning, from the prologue, so you know it exists because it's attached to the others and the cold, and everything. They're weapons that just completely shatter. Hello, that was Marwyn yawning. That completely shatter, you know, castle forged steel, without even trying. But yeah, it's the introduction. Ice magic is something that I'm really interested in because we don't know a lot about it, and I just like the fact that it's this feeling of something different. To me, represents the ice magic. We see it, it's introduced, we see a manifestation of it with the others and their weapons and their language. It's something very different, but we still, after 5-6 books, still don't really know what it is or what it does, who wields it, how to defeat it. Yeah, so I just thought that was interesting, that the feeling of ice magic is introduced in this chapter.
It's definitely juxtaposed with certain images. Royce's blood, I thought I took it down. I thought there's some reference to Royce's blood being like fire. There was something to do, I may be misremembering now, but yeah, I'm really interested in that. I loved the description of the weapon where he says the other's weapon sounded like a high-pitched sound on the edge of hearing. And I feel like for the rest of this series, that's exactly what the threat of the others is going to be. It's just going to be on the edge of everybody's hearing. Nobody's actually going to be really listening to it and really paying attention to the actual threat. Yeah, it is a big question. Why are they going south? I don't know. Will says as well in this chapter, when Garrett and Royce are talking about dead, Will just interjects with the dead men sing no songs. And the name of the book is A Song of Ice and Fire. So very strange kind of reference how that's going to come together. There's also a reference to the trees rustling like a living thing. And I wondered, was that Bloodraven? Like maybe looking at all of this. And I did like the contrast between Royce all in black and the creature being referred to as having white shadows. It's a very kind of George likes to subvert traditional kind of hero and villain roles. Like neither one of them are purely black and white. We're still not entirely sure who's good and bad. And even the fact that the hero, like Sir Royce, is supposed to be the hero type character, and he ends up being the villain in the end. I really like that bit as well. And yeah, I also Garrett, it kind of struck me as well, if Garrett if he didn't flee, if he had gone straight back to the Night's Watch and reported what he'd seen, we may have a very different series. And Ned says in the next chapter about Garrett, he says that the deserters, that there's no men as dangerous as a deserter. So like it's quite interesting that he's literally his lack of courage there. But as you were saying, like to have that, like, to be just so jaded with it. Maybe he just realizes there's nothing we can do with this. There's absolutely nothing we can do. So there's a sense of hopelessness with that. But yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I apologise. Marwyn's decided that he wants to be awake and play, so I'm just going to try and distract him.
No problem.
Sorry about that.
So yeah, that's the prologue then. That's the setting that we're in. There's also a wolf howling. This is about, so this is June 297, and then we jump straight to March 298. So that wolf is possibly the dire wolf that they kill, right? Or that, not that they kill, that they find.
So that's the sound of it dying.
Yeah, it's quite possible that they both arrive. Garrett and the dire wolf both arrives at the same time.
Just before we go on, just to stop and pause for a second while we're in spoiler-ish territory. It was just some overall observations, again, from a kind of technical point of view. This book is obviously the first book. It was written, 20 years ago now? And there are altogether 8 point of views within this book, within this particular book. 6 of those 8 point of views are from Starks, or people who are based in Winterfell, like Cat and Jon, for example. Clearly there's no point of view from Rob, and there's no point of view from Rickon, but pretty much everybody else within that Winterfell setting, which just made me smile, because I thought, as fans of the series, we're always, Stark are the, and it's like, well, no wonder, because that's what we were spoon-fed, really, right from the very beginning, from the first book, is it was pretty much written from the perspective of Starks. So it's the only 2 that are not Starks that are in this book. The other 2 point of view chapters are Tyrion and Daenerys. But the top 3 chapters, so in terms of the amount of chapters from these point of view characters, is Ned, Cat, and Daenerys. So they're the 3, we hear more from them in this book than we do from any of the other characters. But I just thought it was interesting to note that of those 8 point of view characters, 6 of them are Winterfell based, Stark kids, Cat, Ned, Jon. So it's interesting to put that out there, because I wonder if we would feel differently about the Starks if these point of views were written by other people for this first book.
I think I totally agree with you. I more see Kat, even after this read again, I more see her as being the least Stark. Like, she's so Tully. Like, she's very different. But I get your point, yeah, totally. I was very surprised, actually, when I was like, because when you read it for the first couple of times, I didn't really pay attention to the chapter, who was coming when. Very surprised to see how quickly Kat gets 2 chapters. Yeah. She has 2 of the first 6 chapters, which is very interesting. Also, I think I'm right in saying that Ned has more chapters in this book than anyone ever will get in any other book, right? Yeah. I don't think anyone ever gets as many chapters as him.
Yeah, he's got 15.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's do the pin wavy time. So it's safe. We're done with the spoilers for now, but we will have more spoilers, I'm sure. And we're on to Bran I, which it takes place in March 298. From the limited amount of research that I did, so it's a big jump from the prologue, and it also lets you know how far the wall is and how far north. I believe they were traveling 9 days north of the wall, Royce and his mates. And now we have Garrett being caught by Ned and his boys down at the wall. So yeah, this is from Bran's point of view. It's fair to say that Bran has some of my favorite chapters. I think I really enjoy Bran chapters. Yeah, so we begin with the end of summer. So Claire, what did you notice about Bran?
Well, again, I noticed in this chapter there's a lot of introduction. So we are building the story development. So old Nan's tales are introduced. We hear a lot more from old Nan, and just for anyone who's reading this for the first time, I would say pay particular attention to everything that old Nan says. Everybody else just kind of say, oh, well, you know, don't listen to her and she's an old woman and what, but it's what she says is very interesting as you progress through the story. There's also the introduction of the old ways. So we start to find out a bit more about different races and maybe different religions. So we find out that there are first men, and about Ned being very honourable, and that it's different to different areas in Westeros. You get to find out a bit about Valyrian steel. You find out more about, as you've mentioned, these mystical creatures, the direwolves. So this chapter is very much about the pups, about finding the pups. There are some questions that I've got. So again, for me, it was just this is an introductory chapter. I've written down people's ages because I think it would be interesting to make a note of this later on. So Ned, who's the father, the head of the house and also Warden of the North, he's 35, and Theon is 19, which means that he was fostered, or he ended up arriving at Winterfell when he was 9 or 10, I think, which means that Ned was quite young when he took Theon on as a responsibility. And clearly Theon is, so you've got the children and you've also got a bastard child and Theon, who's a ward. So you get an introduction to who the family is and how old they are. So Jon and Robb are of the same age, and Robb is referred to as being 14. Bran is only 7. And I make a note of everybody's ages as we go on, but I just thought it was interesting to kind of make reference to that because it might be interesting just to note that as we progress. Again, mention of the dead, about the pups and Ghost and the direwolf pups born with the dead. So again, the dead is mentioned in this chapter as well as the prologue. And I think, yeah, you just get more of a sense of the kind of geography of the North. It's vast, it's enormous, and it takes a while to get from one place to the other, which will be different if you're a show watcher and, you know, it just feels like you can get from Winterfell to the Wall in like 30 seconds. That's not the case. It's quite a long journey. And they had to travel from Winterfell to, I'm guessing it was in between the Wall and Winterfell, the small holdfast where all of this happened, where they were traveling to deal with the deserter from the Night's Watch. Yeah, just observations really. To me, it does feel, and we will get this further on as we go through the chapters, the first 10 chapters, it feels in this chapter as though Jon is more of the North. So it explains that his features, he seems to understand the fear of the Night's Watch deserter. So I think, I can't remember, it was somebody saying that he it's not the line about being brave, but it's earlier on where they're talking about how the deserter reacted, and Jon said that it was the fear of what it was beyond the Wall. He also seems to understand the importance of the direwolves and the symbolism of the direwolves more than anybody else in that party. You know, you've got somebody there willing to just kill them. They're arguing about what to do with them, and it's Jon who basically pulls them all together and says, look, this is important. So I think that's interesting to note. There just seems to be something of the North about this character. And we get the introduction of the pups being allocated to the Stark children. So again, that kind of begins the you know, there's going to be some kind of relationship there between the pups, the direwolf pups, and their assigned Stark counterpart.
Yeah, so the thing I found about this chapter, it's very hard to talk about it without being spoilery, but I'm going to try and do non-spoilery stuff first. Yeah, pay attention to the old Nan stuff, as Claire said, but also to Ned, because I think Ned pays attention to the old Nan stuff more than he lets on, and we find this out later on, and I can't remember if it's Jon's chapter or Ned's own chapter. I think it could be Jon's chapter. Bran's chapter, when they recall Ned sitting by the fire. I think it's Jon's chapter. Ned sitting by the fire telling them old stories and similar stories to old Nan. So I don't think it's just old Nan. But yeah, so yeah, what I found really interesting was the name of Mance Rayder getting mentioned, and we were going to hear that name a couple of times, mentioned very, very quickly actually in the second line or in the second paragraph there. So yeah, the others again, we have seen them, we've just seen them, and very quickly they're reestablished as a myth. So already there's this like built-in kind of dramatic irony where the audience know, well, no, they're real. Why don't say that casually? They're real. I liked how Robb is described as kind of instinctive, and or sorry, Jon is described as instinctive and empathetic, and he's very silent and still, and it's the complete opposite to Robb, and it's also the complete opposite to Royce that we've just seen. So Jon is kind of being set up as somebody who's a bit different, a bit of an outsider already. And I think there's a nice payoff in this chapter where we already know that the others are real. But the mention of a dire wolf in the last chapter, we kind of went meh. But this time we're like, oh, no, they're real now too. So instantly we're kind of getting introduced to this magic, kind of drip feeding the magic though. And the other thing that I liked about this chapter was the fact that we learned that the snow is already waist high on Bran. Now, I know he's only 7, but this is the end of summer. So the hell is this place going to look like in winter? So yeah, that's the non-spoilery bits that I had there. Also, if this is supposed to be March 298, I don't know how people come up with these dates, because there is there's no such thing as March, January. They don't have those months, but it does kind of suggest though that their climate is very, very different to what we have in our world. So it's already kind of a bit different to us. And
well, they have months, but they don't necessarily have names for the months. They will say in a moon's turn, which means in a month's time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I also liked how, actually I can't say that because I'm gonna wave the spoiler pen, because let's go into spoiler section. So I'll wave the pen again when this is finished. I found it interesting that Bran says that Jon and Robb are kind of old hands at justice, at witnessing this kind of justice, and that later on we find out that Ned has already had to execute 4, or that was the 4th execution that year, and presumably Robb and Jon have seen more than that in their lifetimes. It's also interesting that they will also go on to execute men of their own, and it made me wonder, will Bran have to execute somebody? Will there be someone that Bran will have to take out? And the way Bran says it, it's almost like he's already been there at those other executions, like they're old hands at this, or because it doesn't strike me as something that Jon and Robb would necessarily come back and gloat about seeing. So the way he says it, I don't know, there's something about it that felt like sometimes when Bran says something, it feels like he's saying it having already seen it before. It's a weird kind of he's a weird phrasing on certain things. So which obviously
that kind of links into you know, it feels as though Bran is being watched somehow, you know, don't look away, father will see. And it's like, but how, really? How would he? I don't really think that Ned would notice whether or not Bran is watching what's happening. Maybe he would, I don't know. But it does give you the sense that Bran's being watched, or, you know, be careful. People will notice.
Yeah.
Or somebody, father, that may not necessarily be Ned.
No.
But just going into the spoilery stuff, to me, it's quite clear that Ghost is the older pup, and I can go into that when we talk about later chapters.
Because he goes the furthest away.
Yeah. And he's the one with his eyes open. None of the other pups don't have their eyes open. So immediately you get the impression that Ghost was the firstborn. And if the dire wolves are kind of assigned to and attached to and symbolic of the Stark children, including Jon, then the argument there would be that Jon is older than Robb, which may come into play later on. The other thing was, going back to Old Nan's tales, Bran talks about her telling stories about the others and the wildlings having half human children. And my question is, who in the story might be a half wildling, half other offspring? So that was just a question that I had. If we're taking on board what Old Nan says as having some truth to it, and she's talking about these half human children, hybrids of the others and the wildlings, because the wildlings are set out as, like, you know, they're the baddies.
Yeah.
Then who might they be? Who might this hybrid offspring be? And do they present themselves later on in the story, or do we maybe have clues for that?
I mean, this is open to all kinds of spoilers. So I've always thought that could perhaps be Targaryen, but yeah, that's interesting. And with Bran, he says as well that he tries to pretend that it's like he's seen it all before when the execution happens, and that's like you said, like, pay attention to the ages. Like, he's 7, like to even have that thought is a very mature 7-year-old. But the pups born with the dead, like you said, I think we're going to be introduced to Dany, Jon, and Tyrion, who are born with the dead, which is obviously something that's going to be important for their arcs. And the fact that the Stark children have to raise the pups themselves, it's like the Starks will have to raise themselves as well very shortly. And there's lots of references to Jon having sight, or seeing things that other people can't see. And I've often wondered, and hi Nika, I don't want to spoil anything, but I've often wondered, will someone in this book, a Targ perhaps, or will somebody see something beyond what happens in the book, like some sort of future event beyond what happens in the book that helps them get through something in the book? And I wonder, will that be Jon? And there's also references to the snows around the stump of a tree drinking blood eagerly, which is also very important. And if you're reading it for the first time, definitely watch out for what the trees are doing. So the fact that they're drinking the blood, like Bran, that's what Bran says, they're drinking the blood eagerly. So yeah, maybe watch that out, because it's going to come up in the next chapter actually again with Cat.
Yeah, the snow drank the blood eagerly. I'm smiling because I'm being passed little notes on the back of cake boxes and things here. It's all very, very, very sort of
very high tech.
Yeah, very high tech. Yes, there's symbolism around the direwolf being killed by the stag.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
foreshadowing the Baratheons and the Starks. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, definitely. And also just the idea where Theon says, "Oh, there hasn't been direwolves seen in 200 years," and Jon was like, "There's one right there. What are you, a moron?" Like, I can see one right now. What are you looking at? And I feel like that's what Jon's life is going to be like for the rest of this book. What the hell are you looking at? Start paying attention. But yeah, so yeah, I think that's it for the Bran chapter. Will we move on to Cat's chapter? Oh, I can wave this now. Hi, it's okay now. It's non-spoilery again. So we're moving on to Cat 1, chapter 2. And this is Cat in the Godswood, and it opens with that Cat never liked the Godswood, and she goes to her husband Ned, who is cleansing himself and his sword in the Godswood. Quite an interesting little chapter. A lot of, I feel like of all of the chapters, and feel free to disagree with me here, but I feel like of all the chapters, Cat is one of the more honest people when it comes to her thoughts. People, and I think that's what makes her the least likable. But she's very honest. And yeah, she's a fish out of water, literally. Oh, fish out of water, because she's in Winterfell. Get it? Okay, fish. Tully, how's Tully? Okay, never mind.
Sorry, I was on mute because somebody's boiling the kettle. Yes, I Cat was, I wouldn't say a favourite character, but a very you get a lot from her chapters, and I appreciated that. And I've reread these books several times, but this was, I think, the first time that I immediately started questioning Cat's motivations, and I completely agree. She just doesn't seem to like being where she is, and considering she's had several children and she's been there for a while, all she ever seems to think about is Riverrun and her family. And it's interesting to note that the Tully words are family, duty, honour. You can stand up, Stuart. You don't need to crawl on the floor behind me.
I'm sending that message to TMZ right now.
Just ridiculous. This is such a high-tech studio. Yes, I agree that we get a lot from Cat, and she doesn't pull any punches about how she really feels. For me, this was the most world building chapter in the first 10 chapters, and there's lots of introductions to various different aspects of the story as we go forward. So there's an introduction to different religions, there's an introduction to the fact that there's this massive history around heroes. We find out that there are things like house words and house mottos. I've got there's the introduction to Mance as the king beyond the wall, although I think you said he was mentioned in a previous chapter. And the big thing really is the setup for what happens next, which is the news of the royal party arriving. But yeah, I've got a feeling that I just went straight in and spoke over something that you were already saying, Kat. Sorry.
No, you weren't. No, I asked you. No, you're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, no, go on ahead.
There's just a few things that I want to mention in this chapter. Is, in fact, in the first 10 chapters, I noticed I mentioned to Kat that there's reference to this number 1,000, and this is mentioned actually 3 times in this chapter. So Cat refers to the description of the weirwood trees and the leaves as looking like 1,000 bloodstained hands. And she also talks about the foliage and the humus in the Godswood as being like 1,000 years old. She also refers to the Night's Watch as being below, well, according to Benjen anyway, as having less than 1,000 men, you know, guarding the wall. So it's mentioned 3 times. This number, I just thought it was very strange, and it's the first time I've noticed it, but this number was mentioned 3 times. So maybe there is some significance to the number 1,000. It is mentioned later on in other chapters, and I'll draw attention to it as we come across it. I did mean to, I think I very briefly for a couple of minutes just Googled, you know, the symbolic meaning of the number 1,000, and it's quite, there was reference to it meaning dreams, that it's symbolic of dreams, but also it's just a number that means a lot. So, you know, if Kat, if you were asking me how I was and I said, oh, I'm really busy, I've got 1,000 things to do today, it's just a number that seems to kind of trip off the tongue. It just means a lot of things, a big number, a huge amount. But rather than specifying what that amount is, you would say, I've got 1,000, you know, it's 1,000. So is this just a habit of the writer, or is it something that is potentially meaningful, that this number is dropped several times, particularly in this world building chapter of Cats? So yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. There's other numbers mentioned that are really big, like the last sight of the others being 8,000 years ago, but it's just that the 1,000 is mentioned more than a couple of occasions, and specifically 3 times in this chapter.
And George R.R. Martin's, he has his 1,000 words, a 1,000 world series, right? So yeah, I was just going to say though, when you say you have 1,000 things to do, if that involves nail polish, then you literally have probably 1,000 nail polishes. Yeah, okay, so we're going to go straight into spoilery zone here. I think with Cat, it's very hard not to spoil. So if you don't want to be spoiled, just tune us out for a few minutes and I'll wave the pen again when it's no longer, or when it's safe. Okay, so something I'm going to get into. I know you mentioned a theory that you want to talk about, but there's a theory I want to talk about here, and I'm going to mention it now, but I'll come back to it in more detail later on. The fact that she refers to Robert and Ned being fostered out to the childless Jon Arryn. Now, he was childless at the time he fostered them, but I think that's important, and I'm going to come back to that later on. The children of forest are mentioned in this chapter. Again, more magical creatures that we don't know about. The fact that she doesn't like the Godswood probably has something to do with the fact that Ned is cleansing his sword. And it sounds like some sort of blood sacrifice, like some sort of sacrificial thing. And I think she's making that connection in this chapter herself. I have a question about Cat, and the more I read Cat, the more I wonder, does Cat have a touch of some sort of vision or power or green sight? She has very good instincts. And it's like way beyond, like, you know, a woman's instinct. We all have great instincts, of course, as women. But I feel like there's something about Cat that's just a little bit more than a woman's instinct. I feel there's something about her. She's very traditional and very dogmatic in her own religious practices. But she's very instinctive when it comes to sensing dread coming. And I wonder... Yeah, I just wonder, is that going to contribute to Bran's genetic makeup later on? It may never be explored, but I wonder, is there something about Cat that is very there's something about her that maybe she has a touch of green sight or something.
That's interesting. That's interesting, because my take on Cat's intuition is that if you think about Cat when she was younger and she was growing up at River Run, she didn't seem to be that intuitive. It feels that she's more intuitive since she arrived at Winterfell, and it just makes me wonder if she's got
help.
If is there a mission there that we don't know about? Is there somebody helping her to understand and shaping her view of what's going on? Again, I constantly come back to the house words with Tully: family, duty, honor, but whose family? Because she seems to talk about Riverrun a lot. I just, I'm very suspicious of Cat this time around, and I never was before. So,
I think
interesting.
every Cat chapter, so far, the two that we're going to read, so all two Cat chapters that we've read so far, and I think throughout Game of Thrones, to be fair, throughout this whole book, and for reread, this is for people on a reread, you'll definitely pick up on this more. Stoneheart references all over the place. Not as much in this chapter, but definitely in the next chapter. And it again just reaffirms that, like, I know people were disappointed that she didn't show up in the show, but man, oh man, you can see why. There's just so many references to that, especially in the next chapter. The foreshadowing is off the charts with Cat chapters, actually. It really is. And the connection between Cat and Bran is unlike any other. I mean, perhaps Rob, but I think the connection between Cat and Bran is particularly important. In the next chapter, she lets Sansa and Arya go in her heart, but never Bran. That's what she says. I'll never Bran. So again, here in this chapter, she can feel the eyes following her. She feels uncomfortable. It's almost like she's getting subliminal messages. And whereas some people might hear it as wind, I think Cat feels it. Like you're saying, maybe it's more of an intuition, and maybe she loses touch with that when she leaves Winterfell, perhaps. But I didn't have anything major on this. I just that when Cat says, when Cat approaches Ned, he says, "Where are the children?" And she says he's always asking that, like he always asks that. So perhaps another Stoneheart reference, that she's going to be kind of between two realms, living and dead. Like, where are the children? Where are the children? Kind of, that kind of idea. So, yeah. But I didn't have anything else unless you did for that first chapter.
No, just a very, very rich world building chapter, and I enjoyed it much more than I thought I would, actually.
It's kind of hard not to enjoy a chapter that starts with Cat never like the gods would, because you're like, what the hell is what's the gods would? I like it. Let me be there now. Okay, so then we jump straight into Ed's chapter, and Ned 1, Eddard 1. This is the fourth chapter. And again, I don't know why I always forget, but we're going to Dany. Sorry, I skipped on.
I thought I'd completely messed up then. I was thinking.
No, sorry, I apologize. No, sorry, it's Dany. Okay, so it's okay to tune back in. This is non-spoiler for Dany. I almost skipped on to Ed. The thing to notice with Dany is that Dany is actually before that Bran and Cat chapter. This takes place between the prologue and Bran's chapter. So we're in October 297, and Daenerys is being prepared by her brother, her nasty brother Viserys, and the equally creepy Magister Illyrio to marry a Dothraki Khal king called Khal Drogo. And Dany, gosh, what an awful chapter for Dany. Claire, how did you feel about Dany 1?
Well, again, it's that feeling of the majority of this book seems to be very Stark centric and Stark sympathetic, and the introduction of the Targaryens seems to be as you don't warm to them as much, and Daenerys is a child. I can't remember if we have an age for her in this chapter.
13.
13. But we get the only, well, apart from Tyrion, but the only sort of non-Stark point of view from Daenerys rather than Viserys, her brother. And it's interesting the first note that I've made is that Dany is so frightened. She even seems to be frightened of like soft material. She just seems to be absolutely petrified of absolutely everything. Yet she doesn't seem that frightened of her brother, which becomes more apparent in the later chapters. What have I made a note of again? This number 1,000. Khal Drogo is referred to as having 1,000 horses. So again, this number makes an appearance. We get a lot of the backstory about what's happened to them. That this is this noble ruling house, and that they had to. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sense of my notes as I'm going through this. That they had to flee. They had to flee Westeros, and they have been traveling around the other part of the continent over on the east, in Essos, and the Daenerys wasn't even born when oh god, it's really difficult to know what to say without spoiling things.
Well, if you like, I'll go through some non-spoiler stuff, and then
dethroned. That's the word, dethroned. Sorry. If you, I'll try and make sense of my notes.
I'll go through some non-spoiler stuff, and then we can talk spoilers. The thing to note with Dany is how quickly she recognizes that she's surrounded by men, and she's the only woman, apart from the slaves around her, which she instantly feels uncomfortable with. We also get mention of a new religion here, a red priestess and the Lord of Light. So two different, another weird religion coming into just off Kat's chapter. And I think George, sometimes it can feel like there's no pattern to the way George structures his chapters, but there's definite themes as you move from one to another. And we had Kat very much about her religion, and now we have the references to a new religion. So we're definitely being drawn attention to that. And we also have the very earthy Starks with the trees and the animals and the snow. And as you said, just all these different like textures. And I found that this chapter in particular focuses on like silk and material and metals, gold, silver, like bronze. There's like a lot of reference to different materials, like material possessions. And Dany doesn't feel comfortable with that. And it's very different to what we've had with the Starks, who definitely rule out of a sense of duty and honor and heritage. Whereas Viserys seems to just want power, greed, money, power, money, all that kind of thing. What I thought was interesting is when she, again, the world building is amazing in this chapter, but when she lists all of the main regions in Westeros, she leaves out the north, she leaves out Winterfell. And I feel that, like you said, most of the chapters in this book are dominated by people connected to Starks and connected to Winterfell. And yet here we have the people who want to take over leaving it out. It's almost like Winterfell is constantly, and the north is constantly underestimated and forgotten about. And that'll come up again later on when Robert arrives in Eddard's chapter, that where are all your people? So yeah, it's something. The other thing I noticed that she's very suspicious of the sweetly, sickly smelling Illyrio, and probably rightly so, because he sounds like a creep. And he laughs at Viserys, and Viserys just ignores it because Viserys is so blinded by the fact that he's going to get his throne back. But yeah, I don't think, if he's really going to get his throne back, I don't think Illyrio is going to be laughing at him. So I'm not so convinced about him actually helping them. But
yeah, Sorry.
No. I was just going to say if you want to get into the spoilery stuff, but if there's something else to say, yeah.
Just going back to what I was trying to say before, and I couldn't make sense of my notes, but just for people who are reading this for the first time, to note that Daenerys wasn't born when they escaped. So she was born 9 months after the Targaryens escaped, and after her father was dethroned. So everything that she's not formed her own opinion on any of this history. She's learned everything from her brother, and he was a child of 8 when they fled. So be wary, be suspicious perhaps of some of the memories that Daenerys has, because either she wasn't born, or she was a baby, or she's just listening to what her brother says. And from what we can tell from this chapter, her brother's a bit crazy and power hungry. And you know, just how it must have felt for them to, especially from Viserys' point of view. I know a lot of people, you know, understandably so, have a very you know, not a great view of Viserys, but you've got to think about the fact that he was a child. He was 8, and he comes from this very imposing family and family history, and they've been run ragged through the streets, whether that's real or not, because you know, Daenerys never says, and the soldiers showed up and tried to kill us. It's just this sense of foreboding constantly where they're on the run. And Viserys is referred to as the beggar king. So yeah, you can kind of understand that maybe he's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. But again,
censored as well, you know.
Yeah. These are the memories of children, and what Daenerys is. I mean, she talks about this house with the red door, and we'll talk about this when we get into the spoiler section, but just to make reference that she says, she even refers to her own childhood as the childhood that she never knew, because it's like what can she remember from the, you know, she was a baby, so she's just learned everything from her brother.
I think that's a good point about Viserys, because something that dawned on me this time around, like Dany says that she assumed that she'd always marry Viserys, and I'm not, like that has to be a subject of resentment, or topic of resentment on Viserys' part as well, because he's not remotely attracted to her, and yet he knows that in order to keep this line going, he needs to like marry his sister eventually, and he doesn't want to do that. And so, you know, they're like, he's still a shit, but I agree. I think the pressures on Viserys, the lack of any kind of structure in their lives, the fact that he was around when most of his family were killed and can remember it, I mean, that's not going to leave you with the happiest of memories. In fact, if anything, he should be worse. If you think about it. But let's go into the spoilery zone, will we? Because spoiler. I really liked how Dany said that she listened to the talk in the streets. That she had no like people in Westeros like Illyria did to like prove Illyria's story, that there's old women, or there's women housewives sewing Targ flags and singing of when they'll return and all this kind of thing. But she had no one to confirm that, but she does listen to talk in the streets, which I think is going to be important for Dany, obviously, later on, because she does seek out people who are more in touch with their people, rather than like, not like Viserys, who seeks out aristocratic rich people who don't necessarily have their interests in mind.
Yes, men.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We have a mention of Sir William Darry, and obviously, as you mentioned, the house with the red door, which is a big bugbear in the fandom as to how Dany could have remembered a lemon tree in Bravos. What I will say is, in Jon's chapter, Tyrion does a somersault like a gymnast. So we might have to excuse the lemon tree. That's all I'm saying. I like the theory, but Tyrion ain't no gymnast. So that's you know, I could be wrong. And we also get the doom of Valyria mentioned again. And I just wondered how important will that be to the end game, or knowledge of that, or will it mean anything in the end? And also, Illyria's scheming we'll find out more about later in the series. And I just wonder, how much did Drogo know about it? How much was he privy to the scheming? And also references to Illyria's sickness kind of foreshadows Dany's arc that will have a lot of sickness in it later in the books. And also Drogo is referred to as Aegon come again. Aegon the Conqueror come again, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, that's all the spoilery stuff I have for that, though.
Well, I've got a couple of questions. The first one, you know, it is a huge bone of contention around this house with the red door and the lemon tree, because she refers to it several times as feeling like home, and that's where she wants to return to. But we're told that this is in Bravos. Regardless of whether or not lemon trees exist in Bravos, I did notice that she refers to this house as being, or I'm just trying to interpret my notes there. I need to make better notes. I've got the house with the red door and the lemon tree, and their time with Darry in the big house seems like it may be Westeros rather than Bravos, because you think of I just conjure up the image of, you know, some sort of property with a red door and a lemon tree outside the window. Seems like, and in Bravos seems like a small property, like almost like a cottage type of property, you know, somewhere in secret. Even if it's a manse, it just feels small. But she refers to, or it's referred to as being a big house, which immediately to me means castle. And we know that, just going back to that reference of the lemon tree again, that lemon trees are prevalent in Dawn. You know, so it could be that actually this house is in Westeros, and she was in Westeros for a lot longer than she realised as a toddler and a baby and growing up, but she was just told that it was Bravos for whatever reason. The one thing that I want to just pull from this, because it may be that we come back to this later on, is this thing about Darry. So that basically it was, so we get the impression, well, we're told that it was Daenerys, Viserys, Darry, and a wet nurse that escaped Westeros to Bravos. And we know that William Darry dies, and then we just assume that the two children have to kind of bring themselves up and look after themselves and trade on the name, and they have to sell their mother's crown, etc., etc. But where's the wet nurse that was with them? So who is she? Who was she? Is she, you know, is it just one of those insignificant throwaway things that they had a wet nurse with them, but they had a woman with them that was part of the escape party? We know that William Darry died. Where's the wet nurse? It just seems strange to me that she just vanishes. Mm-hmm. She's mentioned and then never mentioned again. So who is the wet nurse?
And we'll have a mystery wet nurse later.
Mm.
And the thing about her list as well, just as you say, Dorne, Casterly Rock, the Eyrie, Highgarden, Vale of Arryn, Dorne, and then Isle of Faces. And I find that strange, that list in particular, because, okay, we're going to meet all of these places eventually. In fact, most of them have already been mentioned or will be mentioned by the end of Ed's chapter, except the Isle of Faces, which is a mystery. I know you love that place. It's a mystery, and I do agree that definitely there is something weird about Bravos, that her story, and the memories she has of it, for sure. But I'm so worried with Game of Thrones, with this book, about plot holes. Although I will try to explain the Tyrion thing later. But yeah, I am worried that it could be distraction. But I totally agree with you that it's brilliant if it is, because it would make more sense if they weren't in Bravos. Maybe.
Sometimes you can think, well, that's a strange anomaly, but it just doesn't mean anything. Or I'm not saying that the author's making a mistake. Maybe he was laying some tracks, because I know from, well, we know from several interviews that George R.R. Martin loves to bury clues deep within the plot.
Yeah.
But also, we've got to remember that initially the plan was for I think a trilogy, and then it ended up, you know, being much bigger than that. Maybe he had some plots earlier on that he sowed a few seeds and they're just kind of red herrings, or we start to think about going down a road and then we come back again because it was like, oh, maybe he just abandoned that idea. But I think it's still useful to pay attention to.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Especially when an actual person is mentioned, and then because a wet nurse would be quite useful, I would have thought.
Oh yeah.
In a practical sense, looking after 2 children on the run. So where did she go?
Well, not just that, a female influence on Dany.
Yeah, yeah.
Like at this time, most women need to be chaperoned by another woman. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're going to love Arya's arc later on, the fact that she doesn't have any women around her. But it's a problem for Dany that she doesn't. Like, there's no women to prepare her for what's going to happen, so that later on, when she's going to sleep with Khal Drogo for the first time, she really enjoys it, and she doesn't really can't make sense of it properly, you know, because she's so young, as you said. But yeah, I agree. Like, there's definitely things in here that he will have to abandon, and I hope there's a kind of an answer to it, but I don't know. I'm not sure about it anymore. I
can't help but think it's important to remember that she was a baby, and she hears everything. You know, her opinion is for, even though she's she doesn't necessarily trust Viserys, and she doesn't seem afraid of him, and she can see that he's a bit of an idiot, that what shapes her memories, we don't really, you know. She could have been fed and all sorts of, well, this happened and this is who helped you escape and this is what this means and this is the house that it could be anything. So I think I suppose the point I'm trying to make is just be wary of it.
Where did Dari get the money to get that big house? Did that come from Illyrio? Or where did there's a big question over that as well, right? Like the big house with the red door. Like it sounds like it was a quite nice place to live.
Mm-hmm.
And they had servants, so yeah, there's definitely a lot of mystery about it. The problem is Viserys only remembers what he wants to remember. He only sees what he wants to see. He's very AU. Hi AU. AU says, wasn't he a nobleman? He was, but if he's on the run, or like if he's hiding Targaryens, right?
But you know, Targaryen sympathizers, and you've got plots and Dawn and all kinds of things going on.
To me, it would make more sense if they were in Westeros, because it's better to hide out under Robert's nose.
Yeah.
Do you think
Completely.
Viserys is lying, or is building his own position up in society when he says that there were killers after them all the time?
Maybe, or maybe that's what he was told.
Yeah.
Don't know. And I don't know what would have, if they were in Westeros, what would have made them at some point move to Essos, why they would ultimately have had to have left.
Yeah, and again, it feeds in nicely to Ed's chapter. Like, we moved from Cass' chapter into this chapter. Thematically, like, it feels like Daddy's chapter comes out of nowhere when you read it for the first time, but then it feeds very much into Ed's chapter, where we're going to get references again, a lot of references to that time, and to another bastard, or not another bastard, but to another mystery child. So yeah, will we head straight into Ed 1 this time, for real?
Yeah.
And can I say hello to Nika and Jules and Margaret and Lisa and AU and Mr. C, who have all joined us in the chat. And to anyone else who's watching, thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat. I'll take note of them and we'll try and answer them. So we're jumping into Eddard 1. And as Claire said earlier, this is we're back into no spoiler zone. So this is Eddard 1, chapter 4, and Eddard Ned is his best mate in the whole world. The big Robbie B arrives with all his favorite people, all the people from the south, the southerners. So Claire, a lot in this chapter. Oh my God. Okay, I'm going to try and keep this brief. So Claire, do you want me to go first, or will I go first?
Well, I think you've probably got more to say than I have on this chapter.
Okay, you go ahead.
There's a fair amount in the majority of it centers around the crypts for me, and I just got to say again, this number 1,000 is mentioned when Robert talks about I kill him every night in my dreams. 1,000 deaths would not be enough. And it's like, does it have to be 1,000? Could it not be? Could it not be 1,000,000? Could it not be 50? Could it not? Why does it have to be 1,000? I'm going to obsess about this, but I just feel that there's some significance in the fact that the number 1,000 is mentioned so many times in these first 10 chapters. There's a few things here that because I've had my head pecked by MP for so long, that I have to mention about the dialogue between Robert and Ned. And obviously you get a lot of the history, and I just want to throw in, it's not necessarily spoilerish, but maybe something that you can pay attention to later on. That when Robert says that kings are a rare sight in the north, and when he asks where is, it's so vast, where are all your people hiding, and he makes a point of saying hiding under the snow, Ned, snow. So it's kind of like that's meaningful. There's also, again, I just want to pull back to technical things about ages. So back another generation. So we've already been introduced to Ned and his children. And then prior to that, we have in this chapter reference to...
Sorry, Claire, I'm sorry. I'm getting a delivery here and he wants to make a cameo as well. So
hi, Mr. C.
He's waving.
I'm
so sorry.
Yeah, so we hear about we hear about Ned's brother and father and sister. So it's unimportant how old Ned's father was, but we know that he died, and that Brandon, his brother, was 20 when he died, and that his sister Lyanna was 16. So they were very young. I think most of this is kind of more spoilerish stuff, really. Again, the reference that you made earlier about the others take my wife. Everything I've got to be really careful, because everything I've got to say is spoilerish, so I'll just be quiet for now.
I totally agree. Everything I said they say is going to be spoiler as well. Yeah, AU, he's definitely the new hand. Yeah, he wanted to. He's like, it'll be funnier if I just put my hand in. Yeah, so thanks, Mr. C. He's great, really. Okay, so yeah, it leads very nicely from Viserys trying to be king to an actual king arriving, which I thought was very, very nice. We're actually going to see the King Robert that was referenced in the prologue. This strange thing between the conversation, yeah, the Robert is kind of contrasted with the Lannisters anyway, as being kind of, he's associated with leather and blood, where they're associated with fine clothes and gold. There is a bit of a mistake here. It's 9 years since the battle with the Iron Islands, but Tommen is only 7. He's the same age as Bran. And Ned says the last time he saw Robert, Tommen was still suckling from the Lannister woman. So has he been to King's Landing since the battle with the Iron Islands, since the uprising? That's something yeah.
Maybe on his travel, because he seemed to be, there's a whole other video where we can discuss Ned's travels when he left Winterfell and then when he returned to Winterfell and what happened in between. He seemed to turn up at various different places that seem fairly implausible. Yeah, you could just do a whole.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I liked the description of the people from the south arriving like as on a river of gold and silver. I really like that idea that they just look out of place in Winterfell, and they feel out of place. Even after the Dany chapter, like where we see Ed's name and we're like, oh, cool, snow and direwolves again, and suddenly it's like all these weird Southerners showing up. The direwolves are a bit older. Do I have a date? No, I forgot to take down the date for Ed's chapter. The direwolves are a bit older again, and we get this very spooky kind of description of the crypts. A lot of mystery surrounding Lyanna's death, and it sounds like Robert's glory days are behind him. He's gained 8 stone, which I like that George did it in stone. I understand stone. On this side. The Americans must have a hard time with that, but I understand 8 stone. Since I just lost 3 myself, so you know.
Well, 8 stone is another person, isn't it?
Oh, totally, yeah. And that's huge. But he still can vault off his horse, so he's still like you wouldn't want to cross him for sure. Like he's still like Jon later on is disappointed in him, but Robert still sounds, even though he struggles to get down the steps, it still sounds like he could take your head off quite easily. And again, it kind of goes back to earlier on, Ed saying, you know, a man who becomes too divorced. A stone is 14 pounds, Margaret, so it's even more than that. That's a lot. So yeah, it's even more like when Ed says later on, a leader who has other people do his executions quickly lose sight like of what death is, kind of. So yeah, I wonder will we see any of that from Robert later on. And he talks about the spirits being vengeful in this chapter down under the crypts, which is unusual. He also says that Robert loved Lyanna more than he did, which is a line I missed on my last 2 readings and whatever many times I've listened to this. Yeah, Robert loved him. That he loved his sister, but Robert loved her even more. That's the line. I
think I always put this in the context of that intense burning first love that you have as a teenager. And that was taken away from Robert, and he became completely obsessed with this person who no longer exists, this you know, this missing love of his life. And the fact that when they're in the crypts and you can see the statues with, you know, the kings of the north, and Ned makes a point of saying that Robert, oh God, somebody mentions anyway that there's a good likeness in terms of Rickon and Brandon to the stone images are a very good likeness to the actual people inside the tombs, but Robert doesn't think that Lyanna is a good likeness, which to me means he doesn't really remember her. Because if the stonemason at Winterfell did a good likeness of Rickard and Brandon, why wouldn't he do a good likeness of Lyanna? It's just, so he's built this thing up in his head, and when he's confronted with the image of Lyanna, he doesn't even, he immediately says it's not a good likeness. It's basically him saying that's not how I remember her, because what he remembers is something that's so elevated and obsessive that, yeah, maybe he did love Lyanna more than Ned, but what Ned's hearing is this obsession from Robert.
He killed the crown prince for her.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I don't know. It was a strange line, and I'm not entirely. It sounded like it was a line that caused worry for him, that he maybe he loved her too much, which is possible. Do you know, to love someone so much that you create this angelic, like, I mean, later on, you know, I can't actually say that, but that they kind of had this angelic likeness of someone in their heads. That's possible, you know. But yeah, we need to get into spoilery here. So spoiler. Yeah. So I'll wave the pen when it's no longer a spoiler. The thing I loved when he arrives, Cersei says that the dead can wait.
Yes. Yeah.
And Robert just takes a look at her, and Jaime takes her away. Like, I get the feeling that Robert may not have minded if they were sleeping together, but would have minded if the kids weren't his. Is that too much? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Possibly.
I think, no, it's just interesting that, or he's so used to it that that Jaime just kind of controls the sister for him or something. I don't know. It's a weird kind of interaction, but I did like it that Cersei said the dead can't wait, or the dead can wait, which anyone who's seen season 7 will find that very interesting, and the potential for Winds of Winter and what that will mean. I thought that sorry, I'm going to let you go because I can't make sense of my notes now.
I think just that reference to the line from Robert, "The others take my wife." I think that ultimately could be foreshadowing that Cersei is going to align herself with the others at some point in this story, much later on in the books. I know there's lots of theories about the TV show that Cersei will ultimately end up aligning herself with the Night's King and maybe even marrying the Night's King. We don't really get, so I mean, in the books, the Night's King is a legend. We don't know whether or not, you know, he actually exists. We just know about the others. But maybe Cersei will ultimately end up as another.
Yeah.
Or with another.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. The others take her, for sure, because that we've had that in the prologue already, and the others did take them. Miriam says, "Hi, how are you? Thanks for watching. Is it that you don't see the life that you loved in the statue?" I kind of think you might have something there, because the Starks do have a very weird fascination with blood and death, and their idolization of death, and that for them, they can see things in these crypts and statues that other people outside can't see. and that like we can only take their word for it that it's the likeness of Rickard and Brandon, that we're and Lyanna, like anyone from like Robert might be the outsider saying no, this is weird, this isn't them, like this isn't who I loved. So that's totally possible for sure. And also the thing about the statues is that they have direwolves in front of them, which suggests that there's a history of Starks having pet direwolves. And that kind of creeps out Ned as well. And Ned is full of dread going down there as well. He doesn't want to go down there. But yeah, no, that's a really good point, Miriam, that we can only take the Stark word for it, that it's the likeness of the Starks, and that it might have something to do with them being more in tune with, I don't know, the coldness and deathliness of the place. He does say the black hole, that there are black holes waiting for his children down there, which just gives me the chills.
Yeah, it's just there's something really. I mean, crypts are always spooky, but there just seems to be something even extra. Even for somebody who should be used to that environment. It seems to be a very, very creepy place, and these long rows of stone statues. And the old kings in the north. So you get the impression that there's a fierce history there around the Starks in Winterfell. I don't really actually. Having said that, I think I'd said everything that I wanted to say.
I did like how Robert said that an old fishwife or an old fisherwoman, her idea of the common folks' idea of the hand king relationship was that the king eats with the hand shits and the hand shits, which foreshadows Joffrey and Tywin later on.
Yes. Yeah.
I also this is my major theory, which I referenced earlier on when Kat says that Jon Arryn is described as childless. I think Jon Arryn knew about Jon. I think Ned told Jon Arryn about Jon. Robert says in this chapter that he is responsible for Robert Arryn because he says he's my namesake. I'm sworn to protect him, and I think Jon Arryn. Plus, we know what Jon Arryn discovered later on with the bastards. I think he knew about Jon. I think Ned told him, and the sadness that Ned feels when he dies is obviously because he misses him, but that's the last person in the world that knew. And again, we get that from Kat's point of view, not Ned's point of view. So what would Ned have thought if he'd heard Jon Arryn had died? I think Jon Arryn knows who Jon Snow's mother is. I think he knows that whole history. And it just it was just when, Robert says that he's my namesake, I'm sworn to protect him. Well, Jon Snow must be named after Jon Arryn, right? It would make sense that Ned would want to keep someone close by Robert if he's trying to protect Lyanna's child, who, everybody thinks R plus L equals J. It would make sense that he would confide in someone near the king so he could get, just in case Robert ever accidentally figured it out. So that I don't know. I don't know how you feel about that, but something that just kind of hit me this time around. I'm kind of more or less convinced about, actually.
Yeah, that's I'm you sold me.
Yeah. All right, so let's turn to Jon 1, which is actually, I think this is a relatively quick one, really. We're at the feast for the king in Winterfell, so we're back to being non-spoilery for a while, and this is Jon at the feast in Winterfell for King Robert and all the Lannisters. So anything stick out at you here, Claire?
Jon obviously enjoys the company of, he's getting drunk, but he's also enjoying the company of the serving boys at the back of the hall, which which is interesting considering where he ends up. So, you know, he seems to get on with lots of different levels of people. There's this, he doesn't have this you know, this the why can't I speak today? Aristocratic air about him. I thought it was interesting that he thought, but obviously he's also, you know, he's young, he's only 14, and he's got these dreams and visions about how things should be relating to history. And as you mentioned, he doesn't think that Robert looks like a king. He thinks Jaime looks more like a king. Just to point out again about ages, Joffrey's 12 and the younger sister is 8, so Marcella is 8. Just Jon as a bastard, I think it's interesting to sort of spotlight on this. So Meister Lewin says that bastards grow up quicker. So he seems to just have, is he older, or is he just growing up quicker because he's a bastard, or thinks he is, or whatever, you know. To think about, Jon's already thought about joining the Night's Watch. And we learn later on in later chapters why he feels so uncomfortable identifying as a Stark, you know, and he refers to Robb as a Stark, and Robb refers to him as Snow. I thought it was interesting, the introduction of Tyrion from Jon's perspective about this, you know, he's obviously a bit of a showman, the way he's kind of tumbling around. And again, Tyrion mentions that Jon has more of the North in him than his brothers. The rest of it really that I've got in terms of this chapter is just questions. We have the interaction with Uncle Benjen, so we're introduced to Ned's brother, who's part of the Night's Watch, and the interaction between Uncle Benjen and Jon, which I thought was quite interesting. But the rest of it really that I have is kind of spoilery stuff.
Yeah, I don't have very much here that isn't spoilery. I had a question as well. How often does Benjen visit? Just wondered, how often does he actually get to leave the wall? Especially if they're going out in that many ranges. I just wondered, because he knows them quite well. So I wondered about that. I think his relationship with Ghost so far, I think it's interesting that he's the closest relationship that we've seen with one of the direwolves so far. And I liked how Tyrion is a gymnast at the end of this chapter, but he waddles in at the beginning of it, which I don't know what that's about. I might have an explanation for that later on. And yeah, the fact that, like Dany, Jon definitely feels more comfortable with the common folk, if you like. And there's the fact that he is a Targaryen hero, and that we are fully introduced to Tyrion and Arya through Jon first, which is very interesting. Also, most important conversation ever. I know, Claire, this will give you anxiety, how much I've destroyed my book, but this is the last page of that chapter. Lots of little notes and underlining and all the rest. But yeah, let's get straight into spoilery stuff, because it's spoiler all the way for this one. So what was spoilery for you?
That I did the Uncle Benjen. The question that I've got is, why did Benjen join the Night's Watch when it seems in this chapter as though he didn't want to? And I know he probably is trying to put Jon off joining the Night's Watch and thinking about it at such a young age, but he's not that young, in terms of how children age and the responsibilities that people have at a young age.
Especially when we know that Royce joined when he was 17.
Yeah, exactly. He talks about it being a heavy price, which, and if you only knew what the oath would cost you, it feels to me like, the question is, was that a choice? Was as it is with Jon. Jon's already thought about it. He's thought about it being, you know, what he wants to do. He wants to commit to this. And with Benjen, it feels as though the way he describes it, that maybe he was forced rather than it being a choice. So why would that have happened? Why would Benjen have been forced to join the Night's Watch? The other question that I've got is, was Jon kept away from the royal table on purpose, not just because he's a bastard, but for other reasons? Maybe Ned was trying to keep him away from questions or prying eyes within the royal party. King again is mentioned. This phrase "king" is not just in terms of Robert, but it's mentioned a few times when Robert's asking about kings are, you know, kings are a rare sight in the north, and Jon sees Tyrion standing in the doorway, and for a moment he was as tall as a king. Yeah, I think just going back to Tyrion and the kind of showman and the tumbling and things, he did. I can't remember the name of the brother that went missing in search of the, like, Tywin's brother, Geryon, Uncle Geryon.
Oh yes, yeah.
He used to do the kind of tumbling, and it is something that I think is expected when you're a dwarf. You kind of, even in terms of nobility, you're expected to be able to kind of just pull this kind of, you know, show out of your arse and just do a kind of like, oh, I can tumble and I can do this and I can do whatever, you know. It's something that his uncle encouraged him to do, and it seemed to be a kind of fun childhood thing, whereas Tywin was horrified by any of that. So it's almost like I don't know, it's like a protective thing maybe for him. It's kind of like it's a way of Tyrion kind of going, I know I'm a dwarf and I know I'm different, but look, I can entertain you. I can be somebody that you want around you. And, you know, maybe that's what he's doing in this context when he's doing all the kind of jumping around and somersaulting and tumbling. And it's part of his character as a showman, but also it's maybe a way of him making other people feel comfortable, or him feeling comfortable about his status as a dwarf.
And Jon, and we're told that Jon instantly forgets his disappointment.
Yeah.
So yeah. That he instantly feels at ease. And I think we instantly feel at ease with Tyrion.
Yeah, straight away. I mean, I think Tyrion was probably one of my favorite characters. I used to love just kind of curling up, reading you know, it was like, oh great, a Tyrion chapter, I know I'm going to enjoy this, until we get later on into the books and he just winds me up when he ends up leaving King's Landing.
No, definitely. I know for me, the most important thing about this, and this is like major spoiler if you don't know anything about what happens in book 5, book 3, 4, and 5, don't listen to me right now. Major spoilers for Jon being killed in this chapter. He's comfortable with the other men, but they're laughing at him. He feels isolated. Only Ghost gets him, and the isolation is very real in this chapter compared to everybody else we've seen so far. Even Dany doesn't feel as isolated as Jon does, in certain ways, although they're very similar in their isolation. I'm sorry, I'm getting red wine teeth, so this light is making my teeth look very blue. And major spoiler, because this isn't in the show, but we know later on that there is a key character present at this event, which is Mance Rayder, which is very interesting because Benjen shows up, and also we've had Mance Rayder mentioned in 2 chapters previous. So I think that's something to watch out for, how much Mance Rayder actually sees at this, because he sees everything Jon sees, and we get like the whole royal family. We get all the readings of Jon, like Mance Rayder is very as intuitive as Jon is. You know, he calls Marcella insipid. He says Rob loves being the center of attention. Arya isn't happy to be with the kid that of no importance, which is Tommen. Joff looks like a bit of an idiot with Sansa, or a bit of a dick or whatever. So yeah, they're the two major spoilery things that I have for that. Other than that, I don't really have that much, except to say that Tyrion doesn't disappoint when we do get to his chapter. We get a really nice lead in from Tyrion, but the most amount of mystery about Jon is everything else. Everybody else thinks. We don't get any, like, he's just disappointed that he doesn't know who his mother is, but at this stage it doesn't seem to play on his mind. And I do like when Tyrion says, "Oh, some woman, no doubt." Like, yeah, like it's an interesting way of looking at it. Tyrion going in midair. There's a very similar line later on when Bran is climbing, tumbling in midair, and I just wondered, was there any connection there? But you know, he left it in for a reason. Like, George had editors, so he left it in for a reason. So yeah, maybe it's just to draw our attention to the fact that Tyrion is kind of tricksy, and don't underestimate him. Mainly. Okay, so non-spoilery zone recommenced, and we're going straight into Cat 2. Gosh, I love this chapter so much. Oh my god. So Cat and Ned aching from lovemaking, and Maester Lewin shows up with a message, which fills Cat with dread. So Claire, what did you think of Cat's chapter?
Well, this is another, again, leading on from the previous chapter, that just makes me really suspicious of Cat's motivations, what is going on in her head. It isn't until a few paragraphs in that you actually realise that they were having sex, because the thoughts that you get in Cat's head are, yet again, she's thinking about the architecture of Winterfell, and she's also yet again missing Riverrun and talking about feeling lonely in Winterfell and missing Riverrun while she's having sex with Ned, which just seems really kind of there's something here, I think, about she fiercely encourages Ned to have honor and do his duty. Why can't he see what needs to be done? It almost feels like there's a mission there. She's on some kind of a mission. I don't know whether this is something from way back about her father wanting her to marry into the north to kind of expand, you know, the whole oh god, I keep going into spoiler territory, but what her father's motivations might have been, and whether or not that makes her think about family duty honor.
It's hard not to get non-spoilery about.
I'm going to have.
I think,
yeah.
You know what, we're just going to have to call this chapter complete spoiler zone, because it's very hard to talk about this. So what we're going to call this complete spoiler zone.
Yeah. In the future, though, what I'll do when I'm going through it and I'm making notes is I'll make it definite kind of spoiler.
Yeah, that's what I do. I have like 2 post-its for. But
yeah.
It's very hard with this chapter, I have to agree. But you know what? That's amazing. I never even thought about the fact that she's thinking all of those things while she's having sex with them.
Yeah.
It's just like, I never even thought. It's so alien. Why would you be thinking? Okay, that's weird.
Thinking about how Winterfell was built on hot springs, and how she, you know, this is the, like, she loves her bedroom, and she's got everything that you could possibly think of, apart from the fact that she's having sex with her husband, and that this is an intimate moment. It's almost like oh right, okay, they were actually having sex, right?
And he rolls off her as well.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of stuff here about what may or may not have happened in the past around memories of Brandon. Ned seems to be irritated possibly jealous of Brandon when he's talking about he was born to rule, he was born to be a father of queens, rather than Ned being father of queens. It feels to me, and I'm just going to go into what I think is the sort of spoiler is, it feels like, just from it's very interesting when Maester Lewin cuts in and he kind of, it's almost like he's backing her up rather than thinking about what Ned might want. It feels as though Maester Lewin and Cat are kind of ganging up on Ned and telling him what he should be doing next. This whole weird thing about this letter and where the letter comes from and that it was disguised and it was just, it just feels like Maester Lewin is in cahoots with Ned to force, it is in cahoots with Cat, sorry, to force Ned to go down south. So it's just like, where did this wooden box come from? Who in the King's party would have brought that? Yeah, just in terms of the dialogue, Ned saying to Cat, "What are you doing?" and she said, "Lighting a fire," and I've just put, "No shit." So yeah, she's basically saying, building up this scenario in which Ned has absolutely no choice but to go south. So that's what. And it just makes you wonder, has this been engineered? Has all of this been engineered? And that Cat and Maester Lewin are somehow part of this. She just immediately kind of accepts that she sort of, you know, she knows that Ned isn't going to return. What we were talking about before about her letting go of Sansa and Arya in her heart, like that, like they just don't matter. But yet she can't bear to let go of Bran. There is some kind of relationship there between Bran and Cat. However, yeah, so I'm again, the question is, Cat engineering Ned's departure? If she is, why? What is all this about? And she gets quite angry when they're talking about Jon, and just in my mind it feels as though this chapter, they seem to spend more time, or Cat seems to spend more time thinking about and talking about what to do with Jon than the true-born children. It's like they're referred to, even Bran is referred to fiercely, but very succinctly, whereas the time that they spend talking about Jon and her thinking about Jon, what should happen to Jon, and then Maester Lewin gets involved in it and kind of backs her up, and she, you know, she says quite clearly, "I will not have him," and even Ned says, "How can you be so cruel?" You know, it's the first time that even Ned is sort of observing that, you know, you're actually being really shitty about this here. You know, obviously there's been some history and some tension. She talks about, you know, Jon was never out of sight and he looks more like Ned, and she's worried about that, you know, she desperately wants him to go to the wall so that he can't contend for Winterfell above her children at any point in the future. So it just, but wow, she seems to have really, really strong feelings, very negative feelings about Jon, and that, you know, we see that a bit later on. But I've got here, yes, so it's Maester Lewin again that brings this up. What of Jon Snow? Cat was in Riverrun when Ned was already at the war, so after the wedding. So I presume that they were married at Riverrun, and that when Cat arrived at Winterfell, Jon was already there, which again wound her up immediately. So Jon and the wet nurse were already at Winterfell. There's the beginnings of these rumours about who Jon's mother can be. And that quote, that infamous quote, you know, "Jon is of my blood." But so, you know, we know therefore that he's got some Stark blood in him, but you just don't know what the combination of that might be. But yeah, she just doesn't want him around at all to contest any of her children for Winterfell in the future. It feels as though she's got a mission. She's got some kind of mandate from somebody to engineer what's going on at Winterfell. And I didn't see any of this really in the initial rereads. The first time I read through these books, it was just purely for enjoyment of the plot and the story. And how, you know, the expanse of the story. But oh God, there's just so much in the dialogue in these early chapters. And this one particularly just, you know,
how dare you enjoy
another phrase, it speaks volumes. Yeah. Sorry.
How dare you enjoy them? It's so hard to say, like this is my third time reading this book, but I've listened to it a lot. But it's just so hard not to go, what's that mean? What's that mean? What's that mean?
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I totally agree with you about the Jon thing. And I wonder, again, this Bran connection, is she being compelled to drive him away, to drive Jon away? And it's very strange how she lets go of Sansa and Arya straight away in her heart. But she has a very different attitude towards what's expected of women. Family, duty, honor. Whereas Ned, it's honor, duty, family. So they're incompatible straight away. And Miriam says, I thought it looked like she was afraid of what Jon can become. And I totally agree with you there. I think that's she's afraid of what Jon is. And even Jon says that there's a path for all the Stark children. You know, Sansa and Arya will get married to someone, Robb will be the Lord, Bran will get some nice castle somewhere in Rickon. There's no path for Jon, so Jon is too much of a wild card for her to have him around. There is so much Lady Stoneheart in this chapter. It's crazy. And like this time,
just give me two seconds, sorry.
No problem. I'm going to drink wine. So yeah, so if anyone has any questions, you can ask them in the chat as well. But yeah, so much Stoneheart in this chapter. First of all, she's cold. She also mentions that Winterfell is on hot springs, which, why are the crypts so cold? Which is, yeah, anyway. Yeah, the broken, she talks about the broken antler, but lodged in the throat, like of the direwolf. So that's the first Stoneheart thing. Her sense of dread, the focus on the children, but that's a big thing for the Stoneheart arc as well. Ned feels, his words are like an icy draft. She says that in her heart she let go of Sansa and Arya, particularly. Ned grabs her arms and leaves red marks on her arms, and Ned feels the anger in her and pulls away. And also she could never find it in her heart to love Jon. And I just wonder, yeah, Lewin says when Jon wants to go to the Night's Watch, Ned says, oh, he's too young to go to the Night's Watch. And Lewin says, I'm really suspicious of him. And I feel like if you've only ever watched the show, and he comes off as a really kind of nice fatherly character, but I'm really suspicious of him. Stuff up his sleeves all the time. I don't know. But he says that Jon Snow's road will be no crueler than their road, which is not true. So, yeah. And also, how would he know that? But we know it's not true. Having read the books, we know it's not true. But his road has already been cruel. And we know that from the way George has structured this. He's put Jon before Cat in this chapter. So we're already getting, like, we may have liked Cat in her first chapter, but in this chapter we're going, that poor kid is like alienated and isolated and depressed, and he wants to give up his whole life and join the Night's Watch, which, you know, we know what happens to people in the Night's Watch from the prologue. So Cat just comes off as being very cruel here and very cold. So.
To the point where in the previous chapter, Jon says quite fiercely, he's drunk as well at the time. He's getting quite drunk and wound up. But he says to Benjen, I will never father a bastard. So it just tells you, wow, his experience must have been horrific at the hands of Cat.
And but no, I mean, just possible experience as well.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, God, it could have been a lot worse, you know, like she says, he's everywhere, which means he's part of the family. But
And he sleeps in with the brothers.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like he's out on his own in a stable somewhere, living under the stairs like Harry Potter. He's actually like part of the family. Yeah, it's one of those things that it can't be easy for Cat. It's the one thing as a woman in an aristocratic role you should expect to have some sort of like say about where the bastards go. But Ned has never given her that option, and yeah, I think it's easy for us to see her being cruel, but it seems like, yeah, it's hard to know whether her and Ned are actually even in love, because she says that she asked him once about Shara Dane, and she basically knew she could never ask him again. Like, why is she so afraid of him that she can never ask him again? Like, what is the threat there? Because we don't get that sense of threat from him.
No.
Why does she? Like, and then when she mentions Brandon, Ned like says he doesn't, like, that's it. Like, once you mention Brandon, you know, that's it. The conversation's over.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very strange relationship. It's also the last time they're ever going to have sex that we know of.
Yeah.
They never, so there's no option for her to be a mother again. And it kind of undermines her role as a mother. And Tyrion undermined the role of mothers in the end of the last chapter when he says, "Oh, some woman," you know. And yet for her, the most defining thing is that she's a mother.
Yeah.
However, she allows the fact that she's a sister to kind of override that and goes with Lysa in this chapter, even though, yeah, who the hell sent the message? Who the hell delivered that? Why would Lysa deliver it like that? Ned is much more cautious, but Lewin and Cat kind of say, no, we should trust it, and you should go to King's Landing. So, yeah. Yeah, it's hard with Cat not to talk about spoilers. Okay, so we're on to Arya. Spoiler zone over. Non-spoiler zone with Arya. I love Arya chapters. So Arya is sewing, and she's not very good at it. And we are introduced to Sansa, who comes off as very regal in this chapter. So regal, in fact, that I'd be very surprised to even get a Sansa chapter later on in the book, but we do. Yeah, so and we also get this really heartfelt sibling moment with Jon and Arya in this chapter as they look at the other boys fighting in the yard. So what did you think of this chapter?
I think this is it sets up Joffrey as a complete turd. So this is the first chapter. This is the first time that we say, oh my God, you know, this is what's to come. It just generally sets up the tension between the Lannisters and the Starks, and that goes from the sewing in the needlework room through to what's happening with the girls, through to what's happening with the boys in the yard. So each of those scenarios sets up this tension between the Lannisters and the Starks. And you just know that this is going to be going somewhere. The biggest thing that I got from this chapter, and this might sound a bit strange, but it's the interaction between the wolves, between the dire wolves, between Ghost and Nymeria. And that's most of my notes, really. Again, going back to what I said earlier about Ghost seeming to be the eldest wolf, he had his eyes open first. Ghost seems to come across here as the older brother. Even Nymeria, who is this, you know, she was named for this warrior queen who led her people across the Rhine, and, you know, this historical warrior hero, and yet she seems to be wary and scared, almost not necessarily scared. There's this kind of, seems to be this like respect around, you're the top dog, I accept completely that you're the top dog. And there's this sort of approval that she's seeking from Ghost. He nips her ear, and she waits to, she wants to stay with him, and she doesn't want to leave, and it's only when Arya says, you know, you come with me, come this way, that she kind of reluctantly turns around and goes with Arya. So that to me was quite interesting, just the interaction between the wolves. It feels as though this is mirroring the relationship between Jon and Arya, Ghost and Nymeria. So you get Arya and Jon and their reaction and their relationship, and how they feel about each other, but you also get this subplot within this chapter, which is the direwolves, the corresponding direwolves, and how they interact with each other. And it is very much older brother, little sister. That's how I see that. Clearly, but going back to the beginning of the chapter, Arya resents Sansa. Sansa seems to have this hoity-toity attitude of like, oh, poor Jon, no one's really going to listen to Jon. He's just, don't listen to anything he says because he's jealous because of his status, because he's a bastard. Arya doesn't seem to like the attention on her. She gets upset immediately as soon as the spotlight is on her. And I'm just seeing if there's anything else that I can say without being spoilerish. I thought it was funny when Jon said Joff truly is a little shit. Yeah, that's and also that Theon seems to want to protect Robb. He seems to be in that kind of like protector role, which I think is quite sad considering what we know about later on. But yeah, just the main things really from me in a non-spoiler point of view is that it sets up the tensions between the Lannisters and the Starks, and also it's interesting the interaction between Nymeria and Ghost mirrors that little sister elder brother relationship with Jon and Arya.
Oh. Oh my god,
a ghost.
It's a ghost. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Pretty much all the same notes here. I thought the most interesting thing about this chapter is how much it contrasts with Dany's chapter, in that Arya prefers the company of men over the company of women. But the whole time I'm reading this Arya chapter, I'm like, Marsha, Marsha, Marsha. Like, it's very much middle child syndrome, and she feels very isolated. Again, very much like Jon and Dany. And feels very unloved, and like Tyrion later on, actually, which isn't true because she does have Jon and Jon does have her, and I think they underestimate the power of that sibling bond. I think you're right. I think Ghost and Nymeria actually kind of show that's important. We get a proper description of Clegane, the Hound, through this chapter, which is going to be important later on. And yeah, I think that's it. It's just that Joffrey's awful. That's it. Everything else is spoilery for me. So I'm going to do spoiler, 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 spoiler. So yeah, I mean, for me, the foreshadowing here for Bravos is huge. Huge. Yeah. So what did you think of the spoiler-wise? What did you have?
I think that just how Arya is represented, her character is represented in the sewing room, in the needlework. I thought it was interesting when she wonders whether or not Septa or Dane can hear her thoughts. I thought that was a bit wargish. I also, just going back to what I said before about she doesn't seem to like the attention on her, which kind of foreshadows that, you know, working in the shadows and not wanting to be the center of attention. She doesn't like the attention on her. So to me, that kind of, it's very faceless men kind of characteristics. Yeah, Needle again, when Jon mentions that infamous quote, you know, when the spring, when the snows thaw in the spring, we'll see Needle locked tight in your dead cold hands, kind of thing. And it's like, is that it? You know, Needle.
It has to be up there in one of the top 3
Yeah.
Theory building quotes.
Absolutely.
From the series, yeah.
Yeah. What else have I got here? Yeah. She contemplates about how life is not fair, and, you know, it doesn't turn out to be that fair, really, for her or any of the other children, but particularly Arya has quite a hard time. And she is, you know, she kind of operates in the shadows, and you can kind of see that in this chapter. And the fact that Nymeria is called Nymeria, which is after a warrior princess, and we know that she protects her people, as in she's going to be protecting her pack.
Oh,
that's cats.
Go fishing.
I'm gonna have to let her out. Actually, sorry, 1 second.
Has interrupted. Yeah, while Claire is letting out Cat at the canals, because she's in search of oysters, clams, and mussels. Yeah, there's the line with Arya and holding needle has to be like, it's one of those lines that will just haunt the book, I feel. And it may be the most important line we've come across yet that we haven't seen any payoff on. Apart from another line in this scene, when Jon, because we get this line with Joffrey having the Lannister sigil on his shield as well as the Baratheon one, and Jon pointing out how weird that is, and they saying that Arya's would be a wolf with a fish in its mouth, which makes me wonder, is that how Stoneheart will end up, or is it because potentially Nymeria pulled Cat out of the water? So yeah, so it's another one that's got, I really like that quote as well. Lots of foreshadowing for Arya becoming a faceless manor. Nymeria's eyes are described as looking like coins. So that's obviously important to Arya's arc later on. Obviously her needle skills and her stitches are all crooked, and she'll be sewing and all winter. She'll be fighting all winter. But not just with Arya, we've also got foreshadowing with Robb and Joffrey, which we have to watch for everything with Robb and Joffrey, because we don't get point of view chapters from them ever. But the fact that Joffrey says, "Come back to me when you've got real steel," kind of thing. So that's what's going to happen, obviously, especially in the next book. So yeah, I mean, the thing that's like, I know a lot of people look at the wolf with the fish in its mouth as being Nymeria rescuing Lady Stoneheart. I actually wonder, is it Arya killing Lady Stoneheart? Because the relationship with Arya and Cat is another weird one. It's very distant. She's more afraid of seeing Cat in her room at the end of this chapter than she is of seeing Septim Ordain. And yeah, and of course we know from the previous chapter that Cat let go of Arya in her heart. You know, so it's another strange kind of one that we don't necessarily have all the answers to, even at this point in the series after Dance of Dragons. So
plus she's the child that looks more like Jon, and she hasn't got any of the Tully features. Yes. So that could be another subconscious kind of like Cat's shunning her because she seems to be more aligned to Jon, and Jon seems to be, you know, paraded around, she says, for all the North to see.
Yeah,
as a Stark.
And doesn't Cat say that she could give? It's not too late to give him another son. Does she say son or child in the previous chapter? I think she says son or an heir. I feel like it's not. I'm not sure if it's child. Anyway, but yeah, she's more concerned with Sansa's future than she is with Arya's future, for sure. Because maybe, and there is a lot about the unattractiveness of Dany, Jon, Arya, and Tyrion throughout their arcs. And like, I don't know if George is particularly sensitive to that kind of thing, but maybe Cat knows that it's going to be harder for Arya because she's not attractive. So it's going to be easier to get Sansa married off. And of course,
maybe
she's going to have the crown. I don't know. That comes up again and again. and it's a very sensitive subject for all of them. So yeah. Okay, so unless you have anything else to say about Arya, we can move straight into Bran II. So non-spoiler for Bran II, and Bran is climbing, lots and lots of climbing in this chapter, and then he sees something that he shouldn't, and he sees something that I don't even want to say. So, Bran, is there anything you can say about this chapter that's kind of non-spoiler?
Again, we have the relationship between the children and the wolves, and it's almost like a safety thing, or it's like, do the wolves see danger and see what's happening, and do they get strength? Do the children get strength from their wolves after the accident? Well, previous to the accident, Bran almost has to kind of chastise his wolf, because we don't have a name yet for the wolf, but he has to be quite nasty and telling him to shut up and stop making a noise and stop howling. And later on, they tried to shut the window so that you couldn't hear the wolf howling outside Bran's window, and he seemed to weaken. So again, there seems to be this symbiotic relationship between the Stark children and their wolves, and how much strength or security that they have in terms of the relationship with these animals. Again, there's with Bran, you get a bit of the history about the Kingsguard. He wants to be a knight, and you hear about all these noble knights in the past. Interesting that Bran can't decide on a name for his wolf, his dire wolf, even though everybody else seems to have chosen a name for their wolves. It's almost like he didn't choose the name, somebody else did. But I think there's a lot here about you get an overview of the layout of Winterfell through Bran's eyes, so you can see and there may even be some areas of Winterfell that only Bran knows through his climbing expeditions. So the tunnels in the stone, and the fact that he gets this bird's eye view of Winterfell. He talks about feeling as though he's invisible when he's up high, which makes me think, is that a kind of metaphor for, if you're up high, it means you're invisible? When you think about other locations and buildings in the book that are like really high up, does that mean that you're just completely invisible from the story? And when Jaime pushes Bran out of the window and says the things I do for love, one, he says it with loathing, so it's not something that he's doing it for something else, rather than he just wants to get rid of this. Somebody's got evidence of him having this incestual relationship with his sister. There's something else there, for something else. He's doing it for love, but he's saying this with loathing. So again, that could be something that we think about later on, about vows and how much meaning the vows have and how confusing it can be, and where your loyalties lie when you're a knight, particularly when you're a member of the Kingsguard. And also, I suppose the question that I've got is, when he says the things I do for love, what else has Jaime done for love that's been horrific, that maybe we don't know about at this point in the story? Yeah, I think that's all I had really that's non-spoilery. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, again, it's another one that's hard to talk about, but just his obsession with climbing, his obsession with the knights. This felt very, this sounds ridiculous, but it felt more story-like, like fairy tale-like than the other chapters. It sounds like something, it's almost dream-like in the way he's soaring, and how he repeats himself, and it's very childlike. I guess is what I'm trying to say. But we meet a guy called Hodor, who we're told Hodor, the man in the glass gardens, who gave him a blackberry when he came to visit, and that then there's ellipsis that trails off into the next paragraph. It's a very unusual line. I don't know what the glass gardens are. Yeah. So, and a Hodor is written in quotation marks in that line. So I don't know what that means. But yeah, again, just this kind of dreamlike, not quite. It doesn't feel as present as some of the other chapters. So yeah, that's just something maybe to watch out for. And yeah, Bran just talking about how all the other men are heading out on the last hunt. And I found this kind of strange. Bran is old enough to see an execution, but he's not old enough to go on a hunt. Like, I'm not sure what that's all about. I'm not sure why he can't go on a hunt. But clearly he's trying to get as much in of Winterfell as before he goes to Kingsgarden, to King's Landing, I should say. And we learn a lot about Kingsguards here, and it's interesting that then we find the Kingsguard kind of letting us down at the end of this. But yeah, have you ever seen reference to the glass gardens again?
I'm trying to, I think,
because I can't think of any other time.
Yeah, I think it's been referenced before, where it's basically a huge greenhouse.
Okay, it would make sense because they'd have to be able to grow things.
Yeah, and that's where they grow the vegetables because of the harsh environment. There's this special greenhouse that maybe has something to do with the hot springs and the temperature.
Can they grow lemons in there?
Come on.
Lemons in there?
Oh, maybe.
So, because we find out later that this is a bit of a spoiler. It's not really. Sansa's favorite food is lemon cakes. Anyway, it was just something that struck me that I hadn't really paid attention to before, because you don't tend to think of greenhouses with this time period, but actually they would have greenhouses, of course. But yeah, it's just something that I never really thought of before that. But yeah, let's go straight away into the spoilery parts, because there's a few spoilery bits in here. Anything in particular that you want to talk about?
There's a line that Ned says, well, that's in one of Bran's. He's thinking about conversations that have happened in the past and how they've tried to stop him from climbing. And when Ned says, "You're not my son, you're a squirrel," and it just made me think, maybe he's not maybe Ned isn't his father. I don't know. You have to think about things like this with this kind of dialogue.
I think you do when it's only Arya and Jon that look like him.
Yeah, it's it's interesting when you think about the composition and how they look, and also this strange relationship that Cat seems to have with some of her children and just dismissive of others. There's a lot about being high up, so only Bran and the crows could see what's going on up there, and Bran and the crows, as we know, is a huge thing later on. What else? Yeah, I don't really have much, really. Oh, just about Summer's name. That Summer is the last direwolf to be named, which makes me wonder whether or not Summer will be the last direwolf to die.
God, I never thought of that. My thing was, he actually says Jon named his direwolf Ghost, and Bran said, "I wished I'd named my direwolf Ghost first." That he preferred the name Ghost for Summer.
Yeah.
Even though Ghost doesn't make sense for Summer, he prefers that name for Summer. So that made me think, well, first of all, I mean, it shows how great George is at like trying to get inside the head of a kid, that the younger boy will always want to emulate like the older boys.
Yeah.
But just the meaning of that, what does that mean for those direwolves? Again, yeah, I'm totally with you. Cat and Bran, I kind of feel like there's something there with Cat, whether it's Bran talking to her all the time, or she has some sort of intuition that helps Bran in his genetic sense. I don't know. There's something with Bran there. Obviously, him climbing is followed completely with him getting a better view of everything, and the fact that he can't remember walking, or can't remember a time he didn't walk and a time he didn't climb, and a time, therefore it follows a time he couldn't see all of Winterfell. So I think that's important. Another interesting thing about this chapter, and I don't know if you've picked up on it because it's the first time I picked up on it, this is the very first time we get mention of Littlefinger through Bran. It's also it's through Bran, but it's via Jaime. So if you want to think of kingslaying, if you want to think of collusion, incestuous relationships, inappropriate sex, all that kind of thing, and obviously the crows howling for corn, yeah, that's going to be important as well later on. But yeah, Bran is constantly talking about legends and things he wished he could see, and also the thing about this chapter is not to ignore what Cersei and Jaime are saying. Cersei says that she thought Ned would refuse the job of the Hand, but he didn't. But yeah, that's all I've got for Bran. Unless you have anything else, it's just interesting to see, will Bran remember this later on? What happened here with Jaime and Cersei? I don't know if he will or not, or how important it is.
I think he does, doesn't he? I think he figures it out.
I can't remember. In Dance? Or no, in Feast?
I'm sure I've got a feeling that he figures out who it was. Okay. Yeah. Because this is like the man with the golden hair, and this is mentioned a few times, and it's like,
this is why I need to reread.
He comes to his own conclusion about it. I'm sure he does, but we'll come to that.
Yeah. Okay, so finally, oh my God, this took so long. I'm so sorry, Claire. Finally, we've gotten to Tyrion 1, which is our last chapter. We'll try and speed this up for next week. So here we go, Tyrion 1. Non-spoiler, but yeah, actually, this is the least spoilery chapter for me, I think. Tyrion 1. So what did you think of Tyrion? Or would you like me to go first?
Yeah, if you could, I've got to like carry Marwyn outside to go to the loo. Sorry.
Okay, so with Tyrion, well, we go from the Lannisters attacking our beloved Starks to a Lannister that we've been looking forward to meeting. I feel like when Bran, like, I mean, how there's no way the Lannisters can come back from that. It feels like we can never trust Jaime and Cersei ever again, and suddenly we're bang smack in the middle of a Tyrion chapter. A Tyrion chapter where the last time we saw Tyrion, he was tumbling in midair, and we go from someone tumbling in midair, Bran, to a Tyrion chapter, and Bran tumbling in midair as a result of the Lannisters. So you see George is kind of like intricately weaving all of these threads together. One of the things that I really liked about the opening of this chapter, is that Tyrion is not annoyed, but he's definitely aware of the howling of a wolf, which we can assume is Summer howling at, or who we now know he will be called Summer, Bran's direwolf. He's howling because Bran is injured. So I kind of, yeah, that's the one thing that I liked. Tyrion tells us that Winterfell's library is really rare. It's got some of the rarest texts in all of Westeros. And we're kind of led to believe that Joffrey and Sansa are kind of stupid. There's kind of this kind of thread here as well. And Tyrion seems to be a better parent to Joffrey than Jaime and Cersei. He seems to be putting manners on him in a way that nobody else is. Because the last time we saw Joffrey, he was just an arrogant shit with Roderick. And a very contradictory view of Jaime here, because Tyrion, who we already like at this point, he tells us that Jaime is like the best of the Lannisters. And we're like, after seeing him push a kid out the window. So that doesn't seem to add up for us. And we're told that, he said like that he says that Brandon is, Jaime says that Brandon is an unlucky name, because he would have been present at the death of Ned's brother, Brandon, the death/execution of Ned's brother. And we're also told that Bran has a special connection with wolves in this chapter, and that Marcella is a beauty. There are other things I kind of noticed from this chapter, but the main thing I noticed was the fact that we go from evil Lannisters to good Lannisters, Bran tumbling in midair to Tyrion, who we last saw tumbling in midair, to now just kind of struggling. We kind of get an insight into how much pain he is actually in, and he kind of gives the world a different view of him. So so Claire, what did you think of Tyrion? How's Marwan?
I just let him out for a wee, and he jumped into the he jumped in through the door on his own, but his foot's bleeding. Don't know if you can see that.
No. How did he do that?
I don't know how he's managed that. I don't know if he stood on something or. I've got to be careful, because the physio was saying that because I might have to go in a second. Because he can't feel his feet properly, he can have to be careful that he's not like chewing his foot and really hurting himself. He seems to be cleaning himself up. I don't know if that was him bashing his foot against the door as he jumped in, or what, but I'm gonna have to check that out in a second. Sorry, I completely missed what you were saying there, so I'm
don't worry. If you have to go, we can finish up. There's no problem.
I'll just go through my notes. Sandor taking the piss out of Tyrion, I thought was interesting. Tyrion seems to be set up as the good Lannister. Again, the connection through Tyrion's dialogue, you can see that the connection between the Stark kids and their wolves seems to be about proximity to their wolves, makes them either stronger or weaker, which I'd never really noticed before. I know that there's this symbiotic relationship, but I didn't realize that it was like the nearer the wolves are to the children, the stronger they feel, and when they're further away, the weaker they feel. When it's Tyrion and his brother and sister in the guest house, and the Lannisters, I don't know where Tywin is actually in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, I don't know where he is either. Is he in Castle Rock? I'm guessing he's in Castle Rock, right?
He must be.
Well, why don't we just jump straight into the spoiler zone, because you need to go and look after Marwan. Marwan is the most important thing. So, spoiler. Yeah, we do get a lot from just Tyrion putting manners on Joffrey. I think is important. I also think Tyrion pretty much knows what Cersei and Jaime are up to. He's watching them all the time.
I agree.
I also feel like there's a weird relationship with Tyrion and Jaime and Cersei, in that they get all the love, but he wants to be part of what they're part of. He wants to be part of their relationship in a weird kind of twisted way. I think he wants to be a parent as well, and a parent to their children. So that's very evident in this chapter. And I feel like he wants to be the third wheel if he can.
Yeah.
But that's all I got from this chapter.
Yeah, you see the interaction that Tyrion's observing between Cersei and Jaime, that momentary glance at each other at the thought of Bran dying, and Cersei being really like over concerned about is it likely that this child's going to wake up? So he's clued into all of that. So I think it's obvious that Jaime knows exactly what kind of relationship they've got. But he talks about his affection for Jaime, because Jaime's the only sibling that ever seems to have shown Tyrion any kind of affection, so he's quite forgiving. So Jaime can do some terrible things that Tyrion will forgive him of, whether that's in an incestual relationship with his sister or something even worse than that. It almost feels like Jaime can do nothing wrong in Tyrion's eyes, which, you know, is going to be interesting for their relationship as it develops later on. That's kind of all I've got, really, apart from obviously setting Tyrion up as this, you know, the clever one and the reader and the historian, and, you know, that's his thing. He may not be a warrior, he might not be great stature and a knight or whatever, but that's his thing. Is he's knowledgeable, he's a reader, he will be up all night reading into the night, and fascinated by these old books and old scrolls that you can't find in Castle Rock or you can't find at the Red Keep. He loves libraries, so you can, and I think again that's another reason that as readers we kind of warm to Tyrion. He seems like the good Lannister, and he seems to be quite clever, and he seems to be clued into the shortcomings of the rest of his family. But yeah, it sets up the dynamics between the siblings, and I don't know why I've got that. Again, it must be through Tyrion. Tyrion's thoughts about the wolves, the connection between about the proximity.
Because he can hear them howling.
Yes.
We go from summer howling at the end of Bran's chapter to him howling at the beginning of Tyrion's.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the least, I felt it was the least spoilery chapter, if you like. It's the one that I got the least from out of all these first 9 chapters. It's a lot. I'm so sorry it went on for so long. I'll try and be more succinct next week. Let me know in the comments if you need the non-spoilery bit, because if we can skip that bit, then it'll be much shorter. If we can just stick to talking about it. If you're not worried about the spoilers, then that would be brilliant. And so if I don't get any comments saying, please don't spoil, we're going to just go spoilers next week and kind of shorten it down a little bit, because Marwyn needs your attention now. And
yeah, he's basically trying to chew his foot off. So,
okay. So thanks a million, Claire. This went on for way longer than I was expected. And yeah, so next week we'll be reading to the end of Bran III. It's actually a much shorter section than this week, but yeah, we're well into it by the end of next week. So yeah, to the end of Bran III for next week. Same bat channel, same bat place, and we'll if nobody has any objections, we might just go straight into the spoilery stuff and keep our notes a little bit shorter, so that you don't have to leave your lovely Marwyn for too long.
I would normally have all the time in the world. It's just that I've got to pay more attention to him because he can't get out on his own.
I wonder, how did he do that?
There's a step from going into the yard, which is about this high, and he's struggling at the moment to, if he runs from, or kind of wobbly run from the back of the garden, or back of the yard, should I say, with some velocity, he can usually launch himself over that step, but because it's dark outside and he can't see what he's doing and it's a bit slippy out there, and I think what he did was he tried to do that, but he smashed his foot against the side of the brick. God. So I just want to check it out because I don't know how bad it is.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Claire.
Okay, though.
And I will talk to you. I'll be talking to you anyway, the messages and stuff. But everybody else, I will see you next week. And thank you, Claire, and thanks to everybody in the chat. And Miriam has already said spoilers galore. So thank you, and thank you everybody who joined us. And AU, thank you so much. We'd love to have you on maybe sometime. that'd be really fun. So anyway, thank you so much, everybody, and thanks, Claire, and best of luck tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye, everyone. Bye.